The reputation of Larry John. He had a reputation, built not on reverence and admiration, but framed on fear. And although he was perceived as a tough guy, he couldn't hold his hands up, which meant he'd be no good in the ring. But who needs boxing gloves when you've got a lump of wood? If you wanted to play pool, you had to put a pound coin on the table. That was the rule. When John wanted to play, he'd strut up and he'd snarl, "I'm next." And everyone would nod. And of course you had to let him win, or he'd wrap his cue around your neck. "Winner stays on," he'd say, and he'd play all night. And when the barman went out the back to change the barrel, he'd lean over the bar and refill his pint. At the end of the night, he'd jump in your cab and say, "Drop us off." And you would have to drive 3 miles out of your way to take him home. And of course, he'd never pay you. Because when you have the reputation of Larry John, everything in life is free. The temp. She used words not designed to come out of ladies' mouths and talked about sex like you'd talk about the weather. She had a tongue on her that put the fear of God into grown men. She said what she wanted, when she wanted. She cared not for politeness or respect, and back-chatted her female bosses and flirted with their husbands. Her hair was too long and her skirts too short for a woman of her age. She drank gin like men sup bitter, and smoked like a docker. Norman in the warehouse used to say, "I bet she's a right dirty cow." A few months later, Bob on security told me about the time he got pissed with her at the office party, and they shared a cab home. Norman was right. The toughest kid in school. He had girls following him, like the pink ladies followed Danny Zuko. And he gave me an inferiority complex just looking at him. He had a beard before I had balls and hands like shovels with dark hairs. Men's hands, scarred from punching and dirty from work. He walked down the street like he owned it, and in a way, he did. He lost his virginity whilst I was still playing with my action man. He was the best footballer at school, but he never played in the team. He wouldn't get up at 9 on a Saturday for no one. The truth was, he was working in his dad's yard. That's why his arms were bigger than my legs, and while I was racing matchbox cars, he was busy stealing real ones. We'd be standing outside the chip shop on our skateboards, and he'd pull up in a stolen Ford Capri, smoking a Rothmans, blowing smoke rings in our faces. And as the miniature floating donuts imploded in the wind, he'd screech off down the high street, wheels spinning, burning rubber on tarmac, and the old men collecting their pension shook their heads, and the net curtains twitched in semi-detached suburbia. Mad Ann. When I lived in my old flat, I had to put my ear to the front door before I put my bins out, in case Mad Ann was on the landing. She smelt of cheap white wine and rolled up tobacco. And if she collared you, you were fucked. Dave. He passed the time of day with out-of-work laborers in dirty bedding shops studying form. Unwashed men with their arses hanging out of oversized jeans. With his winnings, he lined the pockets of fat landlords propping up the bar at the Rose and Crown, with flat-nosed racists telling homophobic jokes. Pubs with walls adorned with old photos of pot-bellied boxers in long trousers and curly mustaches, and pictures of greyhounds and stolen horses, while his wife scraped uneaten dinners into black bin liners. Parents' Evening 1980. One year my mom and dad couldn't make parents' evening as they were due to attend a pre-arranged dinner and dance, so they sent a letter to the school apologizing for their absence due to a family bereavement.
My geography teacher wrote to my parents and gave his assessment of their only son. On its arrival, my mother read out the contents of the letter to me. Peter knows all the answers, he wrote, but he's too fucking lazy to put his hand up. Yes, I said. That's me.
Old George. In my old job, we played a game where we had to guess who was gonna die next. Everyone in the office wrote a name on a piece of paper and put it inside an envelope with a tenner. Most of us put down the Queen, except old George. He put Renee Bradshaw, that was the name of his wife. He was well pleased when he won. My grandmother. My grandmother told me stories about how she slept. 4 to a bed with her sisters, and for Christmas received an apple and an orange. And when the sirens rang out, she'd run to the tube station and sleep on the platform. Of an evening she'd sit, huddled around the wireless with her family, because there was no television back then, and she'd wipe her ass with yesterday's newspaper. And I often wondered why she called them the good old days. Daylight robbery. When the barman at the Harold Pinter Theatre charged my woman over £16 for a glass of red wine and a bottle of Budweiser, and then had the audacity to usher me away so that other customers could be fleeced, I thought of Pinter turning in his grave and wished the barman was in there with him. Rita. Every Tuesday, without fail, she would knock and ask if I had changed my mind about joining the neighborhood watch scheme. I have my own scheme, I told her, but she gave me one of her stickers anyway, and I put it in my front room window for all the world to see. When I saw her the following week, she looked at my sticker and nodded. "That'll keep the burglars away," she said. And she was right. And all the time I lived there, I never got burgled once. And it just goes to show you don't need alarms and security guards and panic buttons. Sometimes all you need is a sticker.
The bored housewife, sick of climbing the walls, fretting over what time he'd stumble in at night. She joined an evening class where she learned how to dig big holes and lay patios. It was years before they found him.
The title gate. He always made sure he was never first at the bar, and would slip into the gents to hide if he arrived before others. And when the secretaries came round the office with a brown envelope for so-and-so's collection, he'd make sure he never had any change. And when the canteen put up their prices, he started bringing in sandwiches. When he left, we had a whip round and raised 75p. The accounts department wrote out a check, and we presented him with it. We haven't seen him since.
Once upon a time in Tesco, I always knew she fancied me by the way her eyes followed me around the supermarket. And if I looked up, she would smile and whisper to her mate on the other till. And she always made sure it was her that served me. And she was always over-friendly towards me, even on a Monday. She knew I was single. The microwave meals for one were a dead giveaway. And even though I was over 20 years her senior, I must admit, there was a time I was tempted. Then one evening I saw her dad pick her up from work in his Ford Mondeo, and I recognized him as the kid in the year below me at secondary school. I shop in Summerfield now.
Granddad. When my granddad got old, he used to bring up all this phlegm, and I would watch him get up from his armchair, walk to the kitchen, turn on the taps, and spit in the sink. "That's better," he'd say. Every Sunday evening, he would walk to Bob White's Fishmongers in Kennington Lane, and he'd bring us back jellied eels and shellfish, and my nan would butter up the crusty rolls and give us all a needle so we could pick out the eye and the winkles. My granddad was a thief. He never got caught, though,
Then they invented CCTV and he had to get a proper job. He run the fruit and veg store down East Lane Market. He couldn't read or write, but he could sign his name and fill out a betting slip. And then he died, and we never went to Bob White's again.
Midnight at Blackfriars. I grimaced as the middle-aged woman leant over the platform and spewed the contents of her stomach. Onto the railway track, I watched as 7 gin and tonics and a packet of regurgitated pistachio nuts bounced off a cream jacket onto the wooden sleepers, and the last train pulled out of the station without her. Real life situations number 1. It's Thursday afternoon. I'm sitting on a bar stool next to the Who Wants to Be a Millionaire computer game, The Black Horse, with Graham. We've just lost 20 quid and rendered stupid by a machine. I asked Graham where he got to last night, and he tells me he pulled that ugly bird, and proceeds to give me in graphic detail an account of his evening, which, although shocking, was quite interesting. He then goes on to say she'd invited him to a family barbecue at the weekend, and he had said yes. I ask him how he gets into these situations, and he says he don't know. And I go back to my crossword, and he goes for a piss. The quiet gentleman, he toured the less populated areas of town, the non-obtrusive bars frequented by the more sedate drinkers where the silence is broken only by the sound of the last order's bell. He would communicate by nervous nods and sheepish smiles. And although he was in his late 50s, he had never married, which caused some gossip in the flats where we lived. Every year, he would turn up at the Tenants Association AGM, where he would sit at the back, occasionally raising his hand to vote, then leave before the chairman closed the meeting, and never once stayed behind for the tea and biscuits. He didn't seem to take visitors, although his brother would turn up twice a year, a thick-set man, younger in years, and we would hear raised voices, then he'd leave, but we never got to the bottom of it. Then one day, without warning, he left. A small van arrived to take away a few possession-filled boxes, and he was gone. There were rumors he'd come into some money. Others suspected a big win on Spot the Ball. But it was all conjecture, and there are so many questions that remain unanswered. Then a few weeks later, a young childless couple moved in unaware of the history they had adopted.
Tramp. The old tramp in the ill-fitting suit, standing outside the co-op, approaches me for money. I give him the change from my trouser pocket, and he promises not to spend it on alcohol. But I know he's lying.
Friday night, Saturday morning. Every Friday night, a cab would arrive to drop her off, and we'd hear her run along the pathway in her high heels to the communal door of the flats where we lived. Her giggles would wake the neighbors, and Ron, who lived on the ground floor, would always appear and tell her to keep her fucking noise down. Without a word, she'd lift her skirt to reveal her sunbed legs, and he'd hurry back inside, muttering and cursing to his uninterested wife. More often than not, She'd have a new man on her arm without his shining armor, and they'd be at it all night, stopping only to quell the sorrowful cries of her newborn baby and the empty promises he won't keep.
Welling a library in 1995. I remember the time I accompanied my best friend to the library. And while we scoured the shelves, I felt an urge to break wind, and when I let rip, violating the tranquility in the fiction section, he walked out disgusted and embarrassed. "You dog!" he screamed, and at that precise moment I realized he had grown up in a way that I never could. The 63 bus. When the little old lady stepped into the road in front of the oncoming traffic, I wondered what thoughts passed through her mind as the 63 bus struck her. And I remembered something my mother once told me. She said, "Never worry about things that are beyond your control." The new landlord. When the new landlord took over the Duke of Edinburgh, he sacked all the pretty barmaids and put an end to the late-night lock-ins and karaoke, and made all the smokers go out the back by the bins for a cigarette, and he replaced the old dartboard with a sepia photograph of the pub taken 80 years ago. Within a month, all the regulars began drinking in the Black Horse, and a year later, the brewery arrived and closed it down, blaming it on the recession, and we all watched when the bulldozers came and knocked it down. November in Whitstable. I wondered what I'd find if I lived by the sea. I imagined myself walking a dog along the beach just before sunset, or riding a bike along the promenade at dawn, or watching the waves come crashing in as I sip malt whiskey. But in truth, once the novelty wore off, I'd probably slip back into my old ways and stay at home, dipping biscuits into tea. Dave's mate. He could down a pint in one, which gave him power. And for everyone else in the pub, and he had the word "mum" tattooed on his right arm to prove to the world he wasn't a bastard, but he was. And it was rumored he held up the local off-license with a banana wrapped in a tea towel. The truth is, he couldn't even hold up traffic, but he did nothing to dispel the rumors. And on a Friday, he'd always leave the pub with Lynn the barmaid, a bottled blonde who wore black leather miniskirts, and he'd shout, "I'm off to put me old Holborn in the Golden Virginia." And everyone in the pub would laugh, except me and Lynn. And he had his own stool in the Fox and Firkin, and if anyone sat in it, he'd dig them in the kidneys with his stubby fingers, but he never dug me in the kidneys. Then again, I made sure I never sat on a stool.
The storm. Your words are an avalanche of spiteful venom, like bitter snarling winds, screaming grotesque howls through forgotten deserted forests, destroying in its path the weak and the feeble. Rotting, decaying branches, injured from previous battles, cling to their fading lives as the merciless tsunami batters their lifeless bodies like 1,000 rabid dogs ripping at skin-torn corpses. Then without warning it stops and leaves, still screeching in its glory and power by morning. An eerie silence hangs from weeping willows as each tree mourns the death of fallen friends and lost limbs, and we rake up its fractured fingers.
Washing your dirty linen in public. It's Saturday night. I'm sitting in the Rose and Crown with my friend. We're talking about the time we shared a house back in the 90s. He says in the 4 years he lived there, he only changed his bed sheets twice. I tell him it was no wonder he never got laid. And he says it was worth it.
Real life situations number 3. I'm standing on a platform during evening rush hour, trying to work out whether the train just about to leave is mine by the time I realize it is. It's gone.
Bumping into the air. I saw her coming long before she saw me. And if I had been quicker, I would have slipped into the doorway of Greg's. And when she introduced me to her new boyfriend, I thought about the time when we drove from Port Grimaud to Monte Carlo in our hired Renault. And I thought about the time when we were walking along King Harold's Highway. And I asked you to move in with me and you said yes. And I thought about the time when we cried in a spare bedroom when your grandmother died. And I looked at your man and I knew he could never make you happy. Just like I couldn't.
When I'm gone, I won't leave much when I'm gone. Just a few poems that mean nothing to no one. And a few badly recorded songs that mean even less. My vinyl LPs and books will be thrown in boxes and black bin liners and left outside charity shops in the village in the rain.
The spinster.
She spent her evenings in smoke-filled rooms, crudely mixed with stale perfume and old spice, working men's clubs full of out-of-work men, carrying slop-covered tin trays back to cheap formica tables with soggy beer mats and bingo cards. Where the resident house band played Flanagan and Allen to wannabe Vera Lynn's, she sat in her customary corner seat, sipping gin and tonics, winking at the old boys from behind matted wigs, with her crow's feet eyes, laughter lines of pain, each with their own story of how life led her here. The years had been kind to her. It was the months in between that done all the damage, and from the back she could pass for 30 and traffic still stopped for her, like time never could.
Formal occasions. I'm not fond of formal occasions, where I have to wear uncomfortable shoes and sit at dinner parties with strangers, looking at photographs of other strangers I've never met nor care about, and talk about holidays and home improvements and decking while sat on hard chairs, unable to smoke, and mindful of my P's and Q's. The happiest day of my life. Alone. I'm walking through a field of rolled hay in Kent in September, with a broken branch for a walking cane. And I think about Wordsworth roaming the hills of lakes, collecting ideas for poems about daffodils and whatnot. And suddenly I realize I'm not so different. And I smile at the wave of self-importance as it hits me. But I walk tall, laughing at my ego. And for a short moment, life felt good. And the trees bowed before me, and the sun was my witness, as the summer breeze gently kissed my face.
Pigeons! A car backfires and all the pigeons in the oak tree shit themselves and fly off in different directions.